Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we are in the month of
Diablos.
And today we're going to be talking about a special game and one of the most reviled in all the Final Fantasy history. It's known as Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Before we get into Mystic Quest, I'd like to talk about the job of the day, or the jobs of the day. And the first one we're going to talk about is the White Mage. Now, I've actually already done a pretty big video about White Mages and Black Mages, which we'll talk about. But for those that didn't see that or just tuning in here, the White Mage is basically your healer, although she also has some damaging attacks, but basically your White Mage is going to be a healer. They've also been known to use bows and arrows in some games, and their primary weapons are usually mallets or rods or similar items like that. So as Square loves to confuse people with their naming schemes, we need to specify what Mystic Quest I'm talking about. Well, I'm actually talking about the Super Nintendo version of Mystic Quest that was released here in the States. So what others are there out there? In Europe, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was our Final Fantasy adventure that released on the Game Boy, which itself was the first of the Seiken Densetsu games and not technically a real Final Fantasy game. In Japan, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was known as Final Fantasy USA Mystic Quest. Now, if you've been watching my other videos in this series, you may have picked up on something. Japan, at least in the early days of the industry, didn't really hold Americans in high regard as far as their game-playing prowess, if you want to call it that. So, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was made as an incredibly simple RPG. Since this game was released in 1992, I'm thinking that it was clearly made for those who are new to the genre and not just like a slap in the face from Square in Japan at the time. And the reason I think this is because Final Fantasy II had actually come out and been out here for about a year, and then Mystic Quest was released. So we got an actual Final Fantasy before we got this Mystic Quest on Super Nintendo. Anyway, talking about the game itself, the game has a more action-y feel to it, almost similar to Final Fantasy Adventure or one of the other Mana games. Exploration had been greatly reduced, and only one other ally is available to you to use on your team at any given time. Magic also follows more closely to the original game, which itself follows closely to the Advancing Magic systems of D&D and those type of tabletop games. While a lot of people think of that as being dumbed down, I'd like to think of it rather as just drawing from tabletop RPGs and not necessarily just it being dumbed down in a general broad sense. But hey, I like to look at the bright side of any particular game, if at all possible. Equipment in this game is also largely irrelevant. There are no shops and only a select few places where you can buy equipment from NPCs. Regardless, more often than not, you're never going to be really behind the curve as far as power is concerned. And finally, leveling works much as it does in a regular Final Fantasy game. However, the max level here is level 41, and that's a really weird max level, but whatever, it's 41. And it can probably be attributed to how short the game actually is. As far as the story and world building goes, you know that I personally don't necessarily like to go into the story much, especially with the Final Fantasy series, but there are a few things that I'll talk about just in general with this respect. Our main character goes by the name of Benjamin, and as you go throughout the game, you'll be joined by 4 different allies. I wonder if those 4 allies could be representative of something. I mean, you ever see that in a Final Fantasy game? Well, let's take a look. The 4 other characters are known as Kaylee, who is from the town of Foresta, Foresta. They must have spent weeks trying to figure out that clever name. Kaylee reminds me of your resident druid, I guess, as she can talk to trees, and the character's weapon is an axe, which, I don't know, I think that's really kind of messed up on a way that I can't put my finger on, because obviously, you know, you use axes to cut down trees, and she can talk to trees, and that leads to some pretty messed up scenarios that I can come up with in my head. But anyway, next up we have Tristam, totally not Tristram, from the Diablo universe, and he's the ninja of the game, I guess. He wanders around the world looking for treasure because he wants it totally for compensation and not just to, you know, steal. And then we have Phoebe from a town called, again, very complex name, Aquaria, obviously based in a water and ice motif. Phoebe's an archer, which I have to give him credit, it's kind of surprising, even though it's clear that these 4 characters are at least representative of the 4 classical elements. Usually see characters from the forest as being archers because of that, let's say, elfy kind of feel. But no, here the water character's an archer, and I don't know, that's at least a little bit interesting. And finally we have Ruben, and he's a character from the town of, so I'll say it together, Fireberg. Ruben is totally not a sandwich who battles with you using a Morning Star. There you go. Those are your 4 or 5, I guess, majestic heroes of the series. Let's take a step back from this absolutely glorious Final Fantasy game and take a look at the next job real quick, and then we'll get right back to it. The next job we're going to look at is Black Mage, and again, I've already done some videos over that, but just for completeness sake, the Black Mage is your primary damage dealer of magic. Black Mages tend to use elemental magic, normally fire, blizzard, and lightning, but they also get other things like damage over time spells, let's say poisons. The most powerful of all the spells are Ultimate. Alright, so I've been poking a little bit fun at the game, but if you consider it as a game that was created to introduce young newcomers to RPGs, the game serves its purpose just fine. It's incredibly simple, and it serves a very, very standard story relating to the 4 elements, which is what you're going to see as a theme throughout the entire Final Fantasy series. I do actually really enjoy this. I like my standard elemental tropes and stories, especially if they're expanded on a little bit. But no matter how many times I see them, I don't know, it's just kind of comforting. Also, throughout the story, you'll get a little bit of classical mythological names that are nodded to. I've always enjoyed this aspect of Final Fantasy because you're being taught without necessarily being known that. So the game does have stuff like Pazuzu's Tower. There's also the Rainbow Bridge Machine, harkening back to those classical myth elements. The graphics themselves are incredibly simplistic with no real style or depth or nuance to them, which is definitely a point of contention. Now, one thing I will say though is that the music is actually pretty great. It's got a Sega Genesis synth rock feel to it, and while the game does easily have a ton of faults, being simple and all of that, I will definitely defend the music all day. I think the music is great in this game. Should you play Final Fantasy Mystic Quest? Yeah, sure, I guess. It's easy enough to get through, and it's fairly short by RPG standards. Looking on howlongtobeat.com, you're gonna spend about 15 hours max. I haven't played the game in, oh god, it must have been 10 years or so, but if you want to play it, you can find it on the Wii Virtual Console store or on the Super Nintendo as it was originally released. So that's it for Mystic Quest. If you enjoy what I do here, please consider subscribing, maybe even sharing this so it'll get out. Maybe not this video, because it's Mystic Quest, but spread the word, I guess. Next time on A Year of Final Fantasy in the month of Diablos, we're going to be looking at a set of games which aren't Final Fantasy games. Well, why are we looking at them if this is A Year of Final Fantasy? The reason is they bear the name Final Fantasy Legend on Game Boy. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.